Keep yourself on mute if you can, particularly while the speakers are doing their presentations, and use the chat function to network, to share your observations, and more importantly, ask questions. We've got two great experts online today, and we will be monitoring questions, and I will try and facilitate as many as we can towards the end of the session. But we also want to encourage you to put your camera on. So depending on the numbers today, if you really want to switch your camera on, put your hand up and ask a question, please do as well. So now for our speakers, I'm absolutely delighted to have two of our CIPD policy experts support the session today. We have John Boyes, who's the labour market economist, and we've got Charles Cotton, who is the senior policy advisor for performance and reward. So John's going to share some macroeconomic forecasts, including some of the insight from our latest labour market outlook report, and Charles will be covering what HR and employees can do to support colleagues, and also touch on what the government has done so far to address the crisis for those living in poverty. So we've got quite a jam-packed agenda. We really do hope you enjoy the session. And as I've said, please do pop your questions in the chat function. So now I'm going to hand over to John. Thank you.
Thanks, Daphne. I'm John Boyes, the labour market economist at the CIPD. Today, I'm going to talk about, some of the sort of background economic factors that have led us to this cost of living crisis, and but also with data looking backwards and a few sort of forecasts looking forwards, which is probably more important so that we can know what to expect when making sort of planning decisions. So we'll be doing a Chris Whitty style next slide, please, today. So next slide, please. Thanks very much. So the most obvious thing, I'm going to look at the demand for candidates and the supply of candidates. And this is real bread and butter HR stuff. So a fascinating chart tracking the number of vacancies from the ONS shows that when the pandemic came along, it sort of fell through the floor. We switched the economy off. But when we switched it back on, it didn't just recover to pre-pandemic levels, it way overshot them. And so we're currently at absolute record levels of vacancies. Now, something that you may notice is that right at the far side of right side of this chart, it's starting to dip, it's starting to soften a bit, but that doesn't matter. It's still at an incredibly high level. So demand for candidates is really, really high. The next few charts will consider the supply of candidates, and I've got a few ways of looking at this. So next slide, please. The unemployment rate. So unemployment is people who are out of work and they are available and looking for work. So if unemployment is really high, you've got a lot of candidates to choose from. Now, the point to make here is that there was a bump during the pandemic, but then it went down and is now lower than pre-pandemic levels. So we're actually at an unemployment rate of 3.5%, which is incredibly low. It's kind of at a level that most economists would call full employment. So everyone who sort of wants a job is in a job. So that means that's one source of candidates that is down. So next slide, please. Employment levels. So if people aren't unemployed, they might be employed. We can see that fell dramatically with the pandemic and it's recovered, but it's still quite a bit short. So looking at these numbers, we're still about 750,000 people short on employment. So if there are less people unemployed and there are less people in employment, then there's got to be a third place that the potential candidates are hanging out. And if we go to the next slide, please, maybe the slide after that, it's inactivity. So people who sort of completely remove themselves from the labour market, which is it's a kind of third place. And it's a legitimate place to be. You could be a student, you could be retired, but it's quite a problematic place for policymakers and for HR professionals who are trying to get candidates, because this is people removing themselves entirely from the labour market. They're not looking for work. And this is the kind of category that's increased and is the one that really worries policymakers, because it essentially is saying our effective workforce has actually shrunk. Now I'm going to go a bit off piste here. Could we go back one slide? I just wanted to include this because I'd looked at the change in numbers of people employed, which is why it came after the employment slide, and I've just cut it by region pre and post pandemic. Just because I thought the results were fascinating. So the workforce is smaller. There are less people in the workforce than there were, about 750,000 less than pre-pandemic. But when you split that by region, I think it's very interesting to see that London and the Southeast in absolute numbers have taken a big hit. And that's pretty much because just the majority, not the majority, but a very large proportion of the UK just live in London, the Southeast. But I thought it was also interesting that the Northwest is sort of almost 100,000 people in employment less than pre-pandemic. And there are other northern regions here. Yorkshire and Humber looks to be up slightly. And then we've got the Northeast, which is also down. So that's a kind of, that's just an interesting angle, that it looks to me like the North has not done particularly well in the same way as the Southeast has in terms of a smaller workforce. So if we could skip forward 2 slides. This is a chart which it really doesn't belong in this presentation, but it's so pretty, and I thought I'd include it anyway, because working from home is something that I've been tracking the whole time, and it sort of shows that levels of home working, they do differ quite remarkably by region, but it's kind of kicked off in every region. But London and the Southeast are sort of clear winners at the top there, have the highest rates of home working. And just in terms of sort of going forward as some of the big trends, it can help you think about, you know, will this facilitate people to work a bit longer, or to perhaps get a job when they're sort of the marginal person who's just in and out of the labour market, just thinking about working or not. But I mainly include it because I think the slides will probably be shared and people are welcome to have a look. So the next slide, I'm looking at some forecasts of what's going to come next. And I've used the Bank of England's monetary policy report just to look at the key indicators. So economic growth is, you know, is the big one, the one big economic indicator. Unfortunately, the most interesting part of this chart is the kind of backwards looking data, which shows that when you switch an economy off, growth just falls through the floor, and when you switch it back on, it sort of overshoots. So you have a sort of 25% contraction in the economy and then another 25% growth. But the important bit is the projection, and the sort of dark blue bar in the middle is unambiguously falling below 0 in sort of 2023. So we're expecting economic contraction, we're expecting recession, essentially. So a lot of the problems that employers are having with recruitment and retention, they could start to ease. So this sort of disconnect between high demand for candidates and a low supply, well, that demand is going to start sort of being dampened down a bit. And so we might find it a little bit easier. Of course, because the demand for people, that disconnect between demand and supply is one of the things that is pushing up wages at the moment. So the next slide shows another key economic indicator, which is unemployment. We already talked about how it was at 3.5%. And record low, you know, it's not actually been lower, but it's expected, you can see, by 2025 to be up near more like 6%, so almost a doubling, and the lighter sort of bars are where there's less certainty that it might be, but certainly it's expected to increase. In terms of cost of living, it's interesting that, you know, you can do something for people who are in work, but this could be, you know, potentially much worse for those who are not in work. But again, this kind of shows that this is a lagging indicator. So this is the interesting thing. Even though we know it's coming, you might not actually see an increase in unemployment until sort of mid 2023. So it could be another year or so of sort of difficult recruitment conditions for employers. And the final chart, if we can have a look, is inflation. Inflation will remain very high. So interestingly, the Bank of England's one job is to keep inflation at about 2%. So all of their projections, they always show inflation returning to 2%. But I think what is sometimes lost is that if inflation just measures the increase in prices. So, you know, if you had a basket of goods which cost £100 this year and they cost £150 next year, then inflation would be 50%. The following year, if that same basket costs 150, inflation will be 0%, but you've still got a very expensive basket of goods. So this is the point. Inflation might come down, but the absolute price level could still be quite high. So I don't think that the cost of living crisis will go away even when inflation dies down. But certainly, if we look at this, we're still expecting, inflation way above the Bank of England's target of 2% into sort of late 2023, and it could possibly be longer. So this is some of the context. I think that we're in an incredibly tight labour market where there's high demand for candidates, a low supply, and inflation that's high but expected to come down, but the price level's still a problem. So yeah, that's really a sort of whistle-stop tour of all the major economic indicators and where I think things are going to go in the next few months, sort of 6 to 18 months. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Charles, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that I didn't quite get to in the slideshow. Okay.
Thank you very much for that introduction, John, and hopefully that's kind of given you a kind of an overall picture of the economy and where we're heading. So the first part of my, well, very brief part of my presentation is going to be what the government's done so far to help support people through the cost of living crisis, and then I'm going to talk briefly about what organisations are doing or can do to help their employees as well. So as you can see, here's the level, what government's been doing. So in response to the cut in the £20 per week temporary increase to universal credit, the government increased the allowance that somebody could earn before it was impacted by the taper. Now, the taper has been cut from 63% to 55%. So now, for every £1 you earn above the allowance, you get to keep 45 pence in the pound. And I suppose it's also interesting to remember that the majority of people in receipt of universal credit actually are employees. Often people think it's people who are unemployed or without work, but actually the majority of people in receipt of universal credit are actually in work. Now, there's been 3 energy support measures that have been brought in by the government. The first one was the energy support scheme, and that was a £400 non-repayable discount. And I think we've all got that now, and we're going to see that being taken out of our stat direct debits over the winter. So that was introduced by Rishi Sunak when he was Chancellor. And then more recently, we had 2 more measures, the Energy Price Guarantee Scheme, which reduced the unit cost of electricity and gas. And the hope was that the expectation of the typical household bill would be reduced to around £2,500. So that's around the unit cost. So if you use more gas and electricity, obviously you'll pay more, and if you use less, then you'll be charged less. However, the expectation is that for those people who don't change their consumption, it's probably going to be around, the typical household be around £2,500. And then for businesses, for employers, there's 6-month support for the Energy Bill Relief Scheme. Now, when the Energy Price Guarantee Scheme was introduced, it was seen for 2 years, but now it looks like it's also going to be reviewed in April as well. And then since then, we had various measures to cut living costs and boost growth in the mini budget, but that mini budget didn't quite work out as was planned. And the only thing that has survived from that mini budget is the reversal to the increase in national insurance. However, there are other state benefits that staff could find helpful, so it makes worthwhile for employers to highlight those to staff. And the other thing to kind of look out for is that now we've got a new Prime Minister, we're going to have a fiscal statement on the 17th of November, which will probably give more information about what level of government support and employees and employers can expect in the future. So what I'm going to talk about briefly now we've kind of dealt with that, is why workplaces and HR professionals should be concerned with the cost of living. So if we jump, I think, forward, next slide as well. So here we are. So this slide is about some research that the CIPD commissioned and published a couple of years ago. the financial well-being and evidence review, and that found that money worries can cause absence, either because people take time off work to deal with these worries, or they're too stressed to work. Or it can be presenteeism, can be caused. People still work, but because of their money worries, they aren't fully functioning. For example, they could be suffering from fatigue because they've lost sleep, worrying about their finances, or they spend time trying to sort out their cash problems during working hours. So not only do money worries impact on employee well-being, it can subsequently impact on employee and organizational performance. So next slide, please. So money worries, as this can also have an impact on employee performance as well. So the Reward Management Survey found back in January 2022, so that's even before the full impact of the cost of living crisis had hit, something like 28% of employees that we surveyed reported that money worries had impacted negatively on their work performance, and that was especially true among those who were low paid staff. That was 34% in that case, and those were people who earned less than 20,000 a year. And even among those high earners, those earning more than 60,000, that proportion was 20% of high earners. And also among the young workers, 24 to 34-year-olds, around 41% of those staff reported that money worries had impacted on their ability to do their job. And the next slide kind of shows how money worries can affect work performance. So 90% of those who we surveyed said that their work had suffered due to lack of sleep, while 12% said that it had that money worries had caused health problems such as stress. And the next slide looks again from the rewards survey back in January, and it kind of highlights some of the issues here. So 28% of employees reported that money worries had negatively impacted their work performance among low paid. And then also we say like 1 in 4 said that the pay wasn't enough to cope with a financial emergency, 1 in 7 had to cut back on essentials, and 1 in 8 said that they didn't earn enough to support an acceptable standard of living. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that there's a kind of a tricky balancing act. So the cost of living is having an impact on employee financial well-being and mental well-being, and that has negative consequences for employers in terms of lower productivity. So it makes sense for senior managers to support measures to protect and develop workplace financial well-being. However, many employers are also finding that their own costs are going up, which limits what they can do to help. But as John mentioned at the same time, many organizations are also facing talent and labor shortages, which is putting upward pressure on pay, making it difficult to kind of work out how much of wage prices are due to the cost of living crisis and how much is it due to labor market pressures, as well as the economic and political uncertainty. Now, few employers are going to be able to increase everyone's pay by around 10% or more, which is what the current level of inflation is around at the moment. So we all need to kind of explore the various options that exist to see what makes sense, both for our organizations and our workers. So the next slide, and the one after that, looks at what we can do to improve the financial position of employees. So one way is to pay more money to staff. So one option is paying a livable wage. Now that kind of enables people to lead a dignified life as well as meeting the cost of living. Now you can work out how much to pay yourself, or you can become accredited by the Living Wage Foundation that kind of works out that amount, or you can perhaps just copy or benchmark the Living Wage Foundation's rate and follow that. Now, paying a living wage can give you benefits over those employers that don't. So people who will be more likely to want to join, stay, and show commitment to your organization, which could cut your costs and boost your productivity. So by paying more, you can get better organizational performance, which allows in turn for you to pay for the increase in wages. Another option is to increase organizational performance first, which then allows you to pay employees more. Now, this approach involves you looking at the design of jobs, work tasks, and the organization to see where improvements can be made to boost staff effectiveness. Another way of boosting pay is using the 1.25% percentage points increase in employer NICs that has been scrapped. So some organizations have already said that they're going to use that to fund employee pay rises, others saying they're going to use it to pay a cost of living bonus. Other options include you can bring back forward your next pay award. So if you increase pay in January each year, then you could bring the date forward to November or December. This means that people get the uplift earlier. It also means that the pay rise will have to last longer than the 12 months, and it could have complications for the annual accounts. Another option is out of cycle pay increases. So some employers are increasing pay outside the annual pay cycle, which is kind of a tactical response to rapidly increasing pay for certain jobs. If you look at, as John mentioned, the hospitality sector, we have seen a number of organizations that have perhaps given people 2 or 3 pay rises this year, just so that they can deal with recruitment and retention issues, as well as the cost of living. Another way of increasing pay is by increasing working hours, which can increase people's pay. This approach can help those who either don't have the opportunity to work the extra hours they need, or the opportunity to work extra extra hours is there. It's just that there are barriers preventing them from doing this, such as childcare or elder care commitments. So in this case, HR needs to kind of look at how these barriers could be overcome, such as through flexible working. However, recent government data shows that the overall numbers of people wanting to work extra hours is at its lowest since 2008. So not many people do want to work extra hours, but that there could be some people within your organization who would like to. But again, you've also got to remember that if people do work more, if it's not appropriately managed, then potentially their well-being and their performance will subsequently slump. Other ways perhaps are offering company shares, which are relatively cheap. If the company does well, then the shares will be worth more and employees will be wealthier. However, it will take a few years for the shares to go up in value, while most employees are more concerned about this year. So it may be that only management employees will be interested in company shares or profit shares. You could also consider giving employees a kind of linking pay to a productivity improvement plan. So if you're able to improve productivity, then they get a share of that improvement as well in their pay packet. Many organizations have given a cost of living bonus or actively considering it to help staff deal with the cost of living. However, for those in receipt of universal credit, there can be potential issues around that, or such as the bonus could interfere with their benefits payment and leave them struggling to budget and make ends meet. So to ensure that this doesn't happen, employers need to kind of consider what other options could be offered. So for instance, you could offer gift vouchers in lieu of cash payments, though again there are tax implications from doing that. You could give a cost of living pay rise, or you could give people the option rather than receiving it as a one-off payment, the bonus, the cost of living bonus, you could spread it over several months, so it acts rather like a temporary pay rise. Now, I admit it's going to be tricky for an employee on universal credit to make an informed estimate of what impact a bonus could have on their eligibility, as their universal credit claim is at the household level. So HR teams should signpost employees to Citizens Advice Bureau, Citizens Advice, to get guidance on how the different bonus options on offer for the employer could impact their household benefit payments. So that's what, recommends suggesting going to Citizens Advice so employees can work out what the best options are for them. And there's also the other issue is what happens if a worker leaves, if they've decided to take their full bonus in installments, will they still get those installments once they've left? So that's the pay aspect. I'm now going to turn to benefits. I think next slide. Great. Yeah, so this slide is based on the Office for National Statistics Living Cost and Food Survey for 2019-2020. And that shows that the lowest fifth of households, i.e. those Q1, in terms of income, spend more on their household budgets, spend more of their total budget on essentials compared with those at the top. Also, those areas that have seen significant price inflation are those areas where lower wage employees tend to spend more of their money. So in the, I think I've got the latest figures here. So in the 12 months to August, we saw things like prices for food and non-alcoholic beverages jumped by around 15%, whilst transport jumped by around 11%, and housing and utilities by around 9%. So the Joseph Rowntree Foundation recommends that to help those most at risk of getting into financial difficulty, employers should consider focusing in such areas as housing, utilities, groceries, transport and childcare in terms of the benefits that they provide. Also, because of economies of scale, often can cost employers less to buy these staff benefits than it would be for staff to buy themselves. For example, compare the cost in terms of money and time to workers having to make or buy their own lunch to what it would cost if the employer provided it themselves. So I'll go through the benefit areas that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation suggests that employers look at. So the next slide looks at what we can do in terms of cutting household and utility bills. Now, these are some examples of what you can be doing to help deal with these issues, these costs, though many of you might be doing some of this already. So for instance, offering rental deposit schemes, giving accommodation and rent subsidies, signposting ways of reducing energy use, as well as offering benefits that could perhaps cut energy consumption, giving paid leave to move home. The next slide looks at ways of kind of cutting food and drink costs, the grocery bills. So here it could be offering free or subsidized meals and drinks. And recently in the papers, there's been stories of some of the supermarkets offering their employees free meals, and even those who don't have access to a canteen, staff who don't have access to a canteen, they're being given packed lunches as a benefit to help them deal with those issues. Retail discounts, providing workplace fridges for people to store packed lunches, workplace cooking facilities, as well as healthy snacks. The other area, the next slide, looks at ways of cutting traveling costs. So that could be letting people work from home to kind of reduce their costs there. It can be allowing people to travel off-peak when it's cheaper, facilitating carpools, providing interest-free loans to buy public transport season tickets or bikes or cycles, joining the government cycle scheme, offering staff secure places to store their bikes or their motorbikes, as well as providing shower facilities for those who cycle to work or jog or walk to work. And there's some more as well. And the next slide looks at the options for cutting child or elder care costs. So again, offering flexible working, giving paid leave for those who've got caring responsibilities, on-site crashes, guidance for staff trying to access the government's tax-free childcare scheme, maternity loans, or discounted childwear. However, it's important to flag that there are tax implications in providing some of these benefits, not only these, but the ones I've just talked about as well, such as providing employees with a work bus, vouchers or meals, etc. So HR teams should kind of explore the potential tax consequences when their workplaces are considering introducing new financial wellbeing benefits. Now, our research also finds, in our next slide, I think, that many organizations are now offering employees occupational sick pay to enable them to take time off work when ill without risking their livelihoods, crisis loans to help them deal with unexpected financial shocks, the option to choose how often they are paid, which allows them to better manage their money potentially, information about financial scams to help protect their finances, options for saving regularly through payroll, such as to create a rainy day fund and to cope with unexpected bills, spotlighting what benefits are already being offered by the workplace and the state, and helping employees access these benefits as necessary, either the employer benefits or the state benefits, as well as running financial awareness programs which explore a variety of topics and help break down the stigma associated with talking about money. Now, there are various internal sources of information that you can highlight to employees, such as that provided by your benefits provider or your employee assistance program, or you can signpost them to sources of external information and guidance, such as the Money and Pension Service. And next month, the Money and Pension Service is launching its Talk Money Week, which is around encouraging people to talk about their money concerns and their money issues, to help break down that stigma, to also highlight sources of information. And it's a great opportunity for workplaces as well to kind of piggyback that initiative to highlight what benefits they provide, as well as signposting where employees can go for more information if as necessary. So next slide. So in summary, yes, the cost of living crisis is a problem. The cost of living crisis is a workplace issue that we should be concerned about. Yes, HR teams can assist employers, their employers, to help their employees deal with this. It's not just about money, though obviously that helps. And when talking to people about money issues, again, it's important to think, to be empathetic, to be sympathetic, and language is important. So this time last year, I know a number of energy companies got into difficulty when they were communicating to their customers about the rise in energy costs and coming up with solutions such as eating porridge, doing star jumps, cuddling cats and things like that. So I think you have to be aware of these issues about how people may respond, and to a certain extent low-waged workers have probably had quite a lot of experience being savvy and living within a budget. However, higher waged individuals or those on middle earners may have had less experience of this. So the cost of living and raising interest, increasing interest rates has probably come as a shock to them. So perhaps they will be more in need of guidance through communications around, where to go to get more information about how to budget, where to go to get more information about how to reduce your energy costs and grocery bills. And I think that's me done now. I think it's now time for the Q&A session.
Thank you, Charles. Hugely informative, lots to consider, and great to hear all the things that we can do to support cost of living. We have had lots of observations, questions coming through on the chat, so I'm going to try and group them as much as I can in the time that I have. And equally, if people want to put their camera on and come in and ask a question, you are more than welcome to. But I'm going to start with a couple of questions from earlier in the session, actually, for you, John. I think the question, the original question was from Kate, I believe, and it was just some of the data that you shared about the Northwest in terms of the kind of lack of home working and what might the reason be. So is it because they decided not to work? What's your view on the data that you shared?
Well, I mean, it's probably really obvious. There's I've got the same chart but broken by all sorts of things. So I've broken it down by age, by profession, and it's just the mix of jobs. That's what it is. So managerial, professional, and secretarial and admin jobs, they all can be done from home, and they have really high rates of home working. And there are other jobs that have lower rates of home working. So I mean, there's not much more to it. Essentially, jobs where you can work from home, areas that have a lot of them, you see a lot more of it. But what's quite interesting is the commute times in London and the southeast are just punishing, like severely punishing. And I think that's a big reason why people tend to work from home in London southeast. Like I know I do. It's a kind of 20-minute average commute versus 45 minutes to an hour for London, the southeast. So yeah, I think it's as simple as that. But that's kind of the problem, I suppose, with home working, is that the inequality of it, and it comes out really clearly in these charts. That chart gets a little bit crowded at the end, but I do have a breakdown of levels of home working by local authority, which I have an awful lot of charts and data on this if anyone wants something a little bit more to see what their local areas like, because there's some areas that have exceptionally high levels, and they tend to be more affluent because they have more managerial professional roles. Yeah, so I think it's as simple as that's the mix of the jobs that people do. Yeah,
I mean, my reflection was probably sector as well, given the kind of public sector presence across the Northwest, John, which you've mentioned. So thank you for that. And then just another question to you, John, and lots for you, Charles, and you can chip in wherever. But another question about, and I don't know whether you've got data on this, but how many jobs do we think have been replaced by volunteers? I know that necessarily wasn't in your data, John, but do you have any kind of sense of that, indication of that?
No, I've never heard of that. Sorry, I don't really know.
Okay.
Yeah, so you mean jobs that were formerly paid and are now done by volunteers?
Yes.
I mean, I wouldn't have thought
one of the forum members have asked that.
Oh, okay. I mean, I wouldn't have thought, because labour shortages are so acute, I would have thought it was more difficult to get someone to do a job unpaid now than it would have been at a time where unemployment was a lot higher. So I would imagine there was like sort of net decrease in volunteer positions versus paid positions. But I've never really heard of that, of the idea of volunteer positions displacing paid positions, except for sort of during the pandemic. I met quite a few people who were doing volunteer work just because they were on furlough or they were out of work, and so no, I've not really come across it. I'll look into it, but I don't think it's.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it could be linked to, there's another question around retirees. So lots of people exited work throughout the pandemic, and then what we're probably seeing is some people returning to work. So they may have left, they may have gone and done some volunteering, but actually they're returning. I can see somebody's hand up or fingers up. I think I'm going to let that person come in because I can see them like this. Jeff, is that right? Jeff, you're on mute. you want to come in, Jeff? You're still on mute. I don't know whether that's because we put everybody on mute. Tess, there's another hand going up.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yes, Jeff.
Okay, right. Yeah, for example, Lincolnshire County Council saved money about 5 years ago with removing paid library staff and paid youth workers. And I'm chair of a small charity in my locality that now runs some of the services, supported financially by the local authority. But we employ a cleaner and a youth worker, and everybody else, we've got a dozen or so people who run the library unpaid, and the support workers for the youth centre as well are also volunteers.
That's very interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, I wonder if volunteers are, I wouldn't even know how you'd sort of look at doing that. I mean, it's certainly the economic conditions are not conducive to getting people to work for free when there's just such a disconnect between the supply and demand for staff. So it's interesting that places are able to sort of get away with it, I suppose. Yeah, I'll look into it.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Thank you for coming in. I do have another hand up. There's lots of questions, but I'm really keen. This is a forum event, so if people want to come in, I think Hallie's on there with your hand up. Do you want to come in?
It is. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
This question is probably for both speakers, and I know great information in the presentations, and I know there may be some organizations, particularly in the private sector, that may be able to implement some of those initiatives pretty quickly. Are there any specifics that we could implement in the civil service? Because as you can imagine, being in the civil service, our hands are tied in terms of implementing some things and implementing them pretty quickly.
Charles, do you want to take that one? You're on mute, Charles.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to press the wrong button. Yeah, I mean, it can be challenging in the public sector where you have collective agreements and bargaining and things like that. But at the workplace, I suppose initiatives you could have would be to create or foster a dialogue where people can talk about their money concerns and worries. They don't feel that they're going to be stigmatized. They don't feel that it's going to have a negative impact on their promotion prospects or employment prospects. And you can signpost them either to existing sources of information, guidance and support within the organization, or outside, again, such as the money and pension service. So in some instances where we have talked to public sector organizations, they do have like support mechanisms in place to help people. So for instance, emergency hardship loans, things like that, which people, if they had known, they could have access to help them get out of a tight spot, but because they didn't know about them, they did get into a tight spot and then ended up getting into financial difficulty and problems. So by the time they then did actually talk to the HR department, the size of the problem was a lot larger than it could have been if they had known about the support that was on offer. So yes, that's one of the things that I think, irrespective of your sector or size, is to kind of let people know what support you have in place already. And I think part of the challenge is often you have these benefits in place, but they're focused on recruitment or retention or performance, etc. And it's trying to reconfigure or rethink about, well, how do these benefits help the employee financial well-being of our staff? And therefore, and then once you've thought about that, and start kind of communicating it, as well as reviewing and assessing, do these benefits actually work? as intended, and if so, if not, is that due to communication, or is that due to something that's inherently wrong with those benefits? But also, where do gaps exist? And I think to deal with that, then I think organizations need to kind of have a financial well-being policy or strategy that helps people to reflect on what they've got and why, and how then they can then use that to communicate it to staff. And John's got a report coming out next month where we ask some questions about employee financial well-being practices as part of our labour market outlook, and that will be coming out next month, and you'll be able to look at what organisations have been doing in this area.
Thanks, Charles. I'm really conscious, and hopefully that's helpful for you. There's still quite a few questions to get through in the next 5 minutes or so. So there are some more hands up, but I'm just going to go back to the chat because we did have some questions in the chat earlier, and then I'll come to the hands up people as well. So I guess this is for either of you. When cost of living payments have been given, but only to those to a certain salary cap, is there any insight or information around the methodology used to decide what that salary cap might be? Probably more for you, Charles, just given any knowledge on that.
Yeah, I mean, organisations perhaps look at it in terms of their own pay scale, or perhaps look at it looking at it externally as well, taking in certain benchmarks. I think the challenge is on the one hand, it makes sense to focus the bonus on those most at need. The challenge is what happens to those people who just miss the cutoff point. So if you have a cutoff point, for example, of 30,000, and you've got some individuals on 31,000 or 32,000, there may be issues around that. So you may then have a taper approach. So the more you earn over 30,000, less the smaller the bonus you get. But then you end up in the position of the government with this, with the fuel support. The more you've targeted at people, the more then you have to kind of the admin and bureaucracy to make sure that you kind of ensure that the people who are deserving are getting it. Sure. And there's a point where actually you don't want to make it so complicated that the whole benefit flows away. The other thing is that when you give the bonus the first time, people are very appreciative and welcome it. However, the second and third time, it becomes almost business as usual. So again, you've got to think about that in your approach.
Okay, great. Thanks, Charles. Louise, you've got your hand up, so I'm going to invite you in.
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
We can, yeah.
Oh, hi, yeah. Yeah, I was just wondering, I can't remember where I've read it or heard it. It said there's a new movement where there's people who have retired who actually return to the workplace. Is this something we've started to see any data on?
I suppose that's one for me, and I've been asked it a few times recently, and I've just said no, I don't know. I was in Parliament a couple of weeks ago talking to its Lord's Economics Affairs Committee about where have the workers gone, and that was one of their questions. Have we seen any evidence that perhaps the cost of living crisis is pulling people back into work? And I think Charles and I both looked at these questions and had our response to both was no, I haven't seen any evidence yet. However, this morning I was looking at, there's a labour force survey, that a longitudinal one, so you can kind of see when people flow from one state to another, so employment into retirement. And I will look again to see if I can find any evidence of it, but it's certainly a phenomenon I've heard more about is kind of unretirement. So it's not just kind of a linear from work into retirement, that 3-stage kind of life model: education, work, retirement. I think it's definitely in a kind of more longer term, independent of this right now cost of living thing. I think it's a long-term trend that retirement's more malleable, and it's not such a cliff edge. We do a bit of part-time working and then go into it, and so I think it's definitely there, but I've just not found any sort of solid evidence that it's a thing right now. But I think worryingly we might see a bit more as the cost of living crisis sort of bites. That's the thing about if you remember my charts at the beginning, essentially they're saying things are going to get worse. The effects of this inflation is going to compound, and unemployment's at record lows, not going to start to rise yet. So I think the worst of it's still to come. And if we do see the more people sort of going back into work. It might not be for another year, 18 months. So yeah, that's my sort of not really very complete answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think as John has said in the past, these are lagging indicators. So it could be months before these trends start to be picked up in the national statistics. So it's a case of wait and see what happens.
Great. Thanks, Charles. I can see Michael. I don't know whether you're there, whether you've got your camera on, but you've been very active in the chat. I'm just going to pull out one of your questions, but you are welcome to kind of come in and ask Charles or John any questions. But one question he asked earlier on in the session was that given pay rises will increase company costs, which will increase factory gate prices, which will contribute to increasing inflation, how can employers help employees without increasing their own costs? And I know you touched a little bit on that, Charles, but it still is that area of tension, I think. So I don't know whether you want to kind of build on what you said in your presentation around that.
Well, one area is on the benefits.
You're on mute. You've just come in. Sorry, yeah, couldn't hear you.
What happens is I click on my little box, but the box keeps shifting around on my screen. So, okay. Yes, in the area of benefits. I mean, we saw the chart, I think, earlier, looking at where lower waged people spend most of their disposable income. It's like food, housing, etc. So organizations that can target benefits in those areas could actually stretch the purchasing power of their employees potentially more effectively than necessarily giving a pay rise. Because, for instance, if you have a staff canteen, for example, you can buy the food at discount, you can cook it and prepare it at discount, compared to how much it would cost an individual to buy and make that food. Similarly, you can buy retail vouchers, grocery vouchers, often at a discount by bulk buying, economies of scale, and therefore pass that on to employees. So again, they benefit from that, as well as helping them employees be a bit more savvy and aware about what benefits they can access either from the employer or externally. Often is a massive bureaucracy around claiming things like universal credit, etc. So or childcare support. So if HR teams can help their staff claim what they're entitled to, that can help as well.
Thanks, thanks, Charles. John, did you have anything to contribute to that? Do you have a couple more questions?
Charles is the expert, but I've always thought it's amazing how the pay and reward survey sort of shows that if you're not absolutely maxing out all your salary sacrifices and your benefits and all of those things, there's absolutely no point in paying someone particularly a higher rate so that they can pay 40% tax and then go and buy something, if you can sort of skip that stage. So that's the one, isn't it, to absolutely rinse all of those shortcuts that get the tax burden down on people. No,
great, thank you. And this is more of a reflection, probably one for you, John. You might have some insight on it. And again, another observation from Michael. He just found some research which says 83% of 18 to 24-year-olds see financial stability as key to their overall happiness. And the same research shows that this age group are more financially aware than their parents. I mean, this is a particularly interesting group of people when we think about some of the things that we're talking about today. Do you have any kind of further insight around that particular age group and the kind of impact of cost of living on that group?
18 to 24. I mean, traditionally 18 to 24 years.
We've lost you, John. Yeah.
Oh, I should be here. I should be unmuted. Can you hear me? Yeah. 18 to 24. I mean, it's really obvious, right? But the amount you earn is it's like a linear function of age, and it basically goes up and peaks around your 40s and 50s and then sort of goes down a bit. So 18 to 24-year-olds, they just simply do not have as much money as anyone else. So it's kind of more imperative on them to keep on top of costs. On top of that, you've got differing rules about national living wage and apprenticeship rates and more. And people also, what's quite interesting about 18 to 24-year-olds is that over the last 30 years, and I have looked, they're transitioning into work at a lot older ages. So, it's not unusual for someone to reach the age of 24 and still not actually have entered work yet. You can imagine if you did a degree in a couple of years, masters, or not everyone goes to university at 18, but it's that increasing levels of formal qualifications. So I think there's just a savviness which is born of having less money, and B, probably because they are a financially very insecure cohort. Just in terms of sort of the generational inequality which is quite a marked problem in the UK. They're kind of at the bottom of the heap, so it doesn't sort of surprise me that they're the imperative to be more financially savvy is there, and ultimately it's probably a good thing, because most of us don't become financially savvy until slightly later on, which leads people like Charles to suggest that we should all be thinking about these things a lot earlier. So I think if anything, that's quite an encouraging trend.
Great, thank you, John. So look, we've just got 1 minute left. There is a question about Northern Rail strikes. I'm not sure that's appropriate here, but we could talk about that. We were talking about it earlier, and it will impact us here, particularly in the north, and we're running our conference in a couple of weeks. But yeah, very interesting times at the minute. But look, I think we're going to have to draw a close there. I wasn't able to get to everybody's questions, but there's lots of kind of interesting observations and networking going on in the chat, and that really is what this forum is about. So I'd like to just say a huge thank you to John and Charles for joining us for this session today, to kind of help inform you about what CIPD is doing in this area. Just a couple of things to close off. Some resources. We have recently launched the Cost of Living Hub, and that's to support our members around how to alleviate some of the financial burden placed on some of the employees in their organisations. So some of the information that Charles has shared today, we've created a hub, and we'd encourage our members to go and look at that. And given everything that we've talked about, and we've really, we've touched on the impact of mental health and wellbeing today as well, a reminder that CIPD members here in the UK and Ireland also get access to the Wellbeing Hub and Helpline. So again, if you haven't accessed that, I'd encourage you to kind of go on and take a look if you need to. So just in terms of next events, we're running a slightly smaller roundtable, which will focus on supporting health and well-being through the employee life cycle, and we're actually focusing on menstrual health. So we'll be running a roundtable on January the 24th, and we will be contacting some of the forum members to get involved in it. But equally, if you are interested in being involved in helping us to shape some of our research and thinking around this area, please do get in touch with us. And then beyond that, in spring next year, we're looking at hybrid working and really reflecting on the hybrid working piece, particularly around kind of impact on employee relations as well. So we've got some things coming up. We want to keep you engaged, and equally, if you do have some feedback, please let us know what you'd like to hear from us as well. So that's it from me. Thank you so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.